You are about to enter another dimension. A dimension not only of sound, but of sight. A dimension of which you have never seen the likes of on YouTube. A dimension where we explore an old pop cultural phenomenon which changed the way we look at storytelling. A TV show considered an important landmark of our time. A dimension where we talk about the classic 1950s TV show, The Twilight Zone. The Twilight Zone was the hit CBS TV show which aired from 1959 to 1964. Each episode would be introduced by the show's head writer and creator Rod Serling, where he would tell us about a strange journey that we were about to embark on. Each episode of The Twilight Zone was a completely different story, with each story being self-contained. But what made it so memorable was the fact that this show would always leave a great impact on the viewer. The stories frightened us, opened our minds to possibilities, inspired us, creatively influenced us, but above all, left our minds open to each episode's social commentary. Themes that, although fantastical, would often point out the errors of our ways, faults in human logic. It dared to tackle themes of discrimination, along with our fears of pending war and doom, a show that allowed us to enter the fifth dimension, where literally anything is possible. So sit back as we journey through the wondrous and often terrifying land of imagination, as we look into 10 things that you may not know about the classic Twilight Zone series. One of the greatest TV shows of all time, and a show that changed modern fantasy and science fiction. So, let's check it out. Number 10. Movie influences. As mentioned, The Twilight Zone was truly an inspirational show, which changed the way of modern storytelling, where serious issues could be subtly addressed, while in disguise as science fiction tales. And many of the Twilight Zone episodes have indeed influenced many movies over the last 50 years, some of which you may even be surprised to learn about. Movies that seem to be heavily influenced by the Twilight Zone episodes, or at least share many similarities, include Real Steel, which is very similar to the 1963 Twilight episode, Still, which like Real Steel is about robots boxing against each other. It even has the gambling element. And then there's Poltergeist, which bears many similarities to the 1962 episode, Little Girl Lost, about a girl getting lost in another dimension in her bedroom, to which her parents have to find a way to go into the dimension to get her out. Child's Play, which bears many similarities to the 1963 episode Living Doll, where a little girl's doll seems to have psychotic tendencies. And then there's Cube, which is very similar to the episode 5 Characters in Search of an Exit, in which 5 individuals wake up in a box-like imprisonment with no memory of how or why they got there, to which they must work as a team to get out. The episode 22 is very similar to Final Destination, in which before boarding a plane, a passenger has a premonition of her own death, so she doesn't end up going on the doomed flight. And the Jim Carrey comedy Liar Liar may have been influenced by the episode The Whole Truth, in which after buying a particular car, a used car salesman is forced to tell the truth. There are many more movies that have similar plots which may or may not have been influenced by the Twilight Zone. But remember, even if not intentional with its similarities, I think it still shows that the Twilight Zone was ahead of its time and set the standard for modern fantasy storytelling. Number 9. Original choice for narrator. One of the most iconic aspects of the Twilight Zone, and the one that binds all the stories together, is Rod Serling's introductions and narrations. His dry wit and way of enticing the viewer in just makes the show stand out, and makes it that bit more awesome. And of course, it would make sense for the show's writer and creator to host the show. However, Serling wasn't the face and voice that CBS originally wanted for the show, as they wanted a well-known actor in the role, and their main choice was legendary actor and director Orson Welles. Serling supposedly was against the idea as he found Welles to be pompous, but it turned out Welles was too expensive for the TV show when Serling proposed the idea that he should be the show's narrator, and an excellent choice that was. Just think of Serling as a 1950s version of the Crypt Keeper from Tales from the Crypt. Number 8. Change of theme. We all know the iconic Twilight Zone theme. The spooky jingle of terror and suspense is instantly recognisable to anyone who hears it. In fact, whenever something spooky in general might happen, there is always bound to be someone who whistles out the theme. Come on, tell me that hasn't happened to you. However, the iconic tune wasn't the original theme for the Twilight Zone, as in the first series, the show used a theme by Bernard Herrmann, who was a brilliant composer in his time who composed many scores for Alfred Hitchcock movies. His theme was more dark and mysterious and felt more moody. But it didn't quite have the punch or memorability. So with the show's next series, CBS decided to change the theme to a more recognisable one and memorable one, where composer Marius Constant wrote the theme that we all know and love. Over its 5-year run, the show actually had many great composers working on the show, one of whom being Jerry Goldsmith. Number 7. Board Game. Often in this show, I talk about video game tie-ins associated with movies and TV shows. Well, considering the Twilight Zone was a product of the late 50s and early 60s, a video game would be out the question. However, that show did get its very own board game, where gamers at home can enter the scary realm of the Twilight Zone. The game was released by the company Ideal, and despite its beautiful packaging, it didn't really have anything to do with the show. After all, how could it? The Twilight Zone was an anthology series. So anyway, up to 4 players can play, as they have to make their way around the 5th dimension. Although the board game may not look like much, remember, the 5th dimension can be deceiving. Number 6. Celebrity appearances. Waits for my return. Pretty Polynesian baby. The Twilight Zone featured many celebrities and would-be celebrities throughout its 5-year run. Fans of Star Trek would be happy to know that both William Shatner, Leonard Nimoy, and George Takei have starred in the Twilight Zone. In fact, William Shatner starred in 2 Twilight Zone stories, appearing in The Nick of Time and Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, which has gone on to be regarded as one of the greatest Twilight Zone episodes ever, if not the greatest, and definitely the scariest, where a paranoid airplane passenger believes that he is seeing a gremlin monster on the plane's wing. Leonard Nimoy starred in the 1961 episode A Quality of Mercy, and George Takei starred in the 1964 episode The Encounter. Other famous faces to star in the spooky show include Telly Savalas, Elizabeth Montgomery, Robert Redford, Roddy McDowall, Burgess Meredith, who starred in 4 episodes, Rod Taylor, Dennis Hopper, Robert Duvall, Peter Falk, Burt Reynolds, Charles Bronson, and Jean Marsh. The irony being Marsh would go on to have a very important role in Doctor Who in 1965, with the first Doctor, William Hartnell, probably making her the only actor to appear both in The Twilight Zone and Doctor Who. Number 5. Beating censorship. Rod Serling had previously had problems with his previous writings that he had written for TV, as he likes to write stories that have social commentaries, stories to demonstrate our ability to show prejudice, to go into war, and to form dictatorships, and of course discrimination, along with other failings of the human condition that Serling would often point out. However, this often led to censorship due to sponsors pulling out of his work, due to his dark commentaries. So in order to not be censored but still being able to address his commentaries, he disguised his stories for the Twilight Zone as fantasy stories. Stories involving aliens and robots and evil dolls. So on the outside, the show looked like a science fiction extravaganza, but on the inside it still contains stories of moral lessons about where mankind is going wrong and how it could get worse if we're not careful. The irony being is that nowadays it's quite commonplace for science fiction stories to be a reflection of our society now, and how problematic some areas of it might be. Number 4. Failed relaunch. CBS cancelled The Twilight Zone in 1964 due to the high budget used making the show and its drop in ratings. And although the show has been revived several times, once in 1985 and then again in 2002, the show nearly got a comeback very soon after its original cancellation. as the channel ABC offered to have the Twilight Zone shift to their network under the title Witches, Warlocks and Werewolves, which is the same name as a book Serling had previously written. But Serling didn't take up on the offer, thinking that it wouldn't be successful, and sold off his shares to the Twilight Zone brand. Which is a shame. It's like the Twilight Zone's father abandoned it. Oh well, we can only imagine how it might have been had Serling taken up ABC on its offer. Number 3, episode Makeshift. As mentioned, in the Twilight Zone's later days, there were issues with the budget, and certain shortcuts had to be made in order to try and cut the show's costs down. And nowhere is this more evident than the episode An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, as the episode itself is actually not related to the Twilight Zone, but is in fact a short French movie, which had previously won an Academy Award in 1963 and was the winner of the Cannes Film Festival in 1962. The short movie, set during Civil War, is based on an 1891 story about a civilian prisoner who believes that he has escaped being hung, only to realise that he has created a fantasy at the moment of his death. Serling thought that this would be a great film to incorporate into the show, converting it into a Twilight Zone episode, thus saving the costs of actually producing an original episode. Number 2, one episode featured a laughter track. Twilight Zone is well known for its scary stories, but one episode in particular took a more comedic approach, with the episode Cavender is Coming, which is an oddball comedy about a guardian angel who grants wishes, only his wishes always turn out wrong. The interesting thing about this episode is that it was intended to be a pilot for a comedy sitcom. The only problem was, it wasn't very funny. Audiences felt it was missing the wit and intensity and imagination of Serling's original scripts. So the idea of a Twilight Zone comedy spin-off were quickly laid to rest, and Cavender is Coming is now considered one of the worst episodes in the series. But considering the original Twilight Zone had 156 episodes and Serling wrote 99 of those episodes, I think we can forgive the odd bad episode here and there. Number 1, the Twilight Zone started off as something different. In 1958, 1 year before The Twilight Zone was broadcast, CBS screened a story Rod Serling had written called The Time Element, which was to be a pilot for an anthology series similar to The Twilight Zone. Set during World War II, it tells the story of a man having visions of Pearl Harbor being attacked before it actually happens. The Time Element is without a doubt the genesis of The Twilight Zone, and just like The Twilight Zone, features science fiction and fantasy elements along with a narration. The pilot was successful with audiences, who all seemed to enjoy Serling's narration along with his charm and wit, so it was from that CBS convinced him to work on The Twilight Zone instead, and the rest was fifth-dimensional history. Well guys, that was my look into The Twilight Zone, and even though the show has aged, I mean, come on, that's bound to happen, it's nearly 60 years old. The life lessons and commentaries and wonders and imagination have not. They still have just as much impact now as they did back in the late 50s. Anyway, I'm Minty, and if you ever find yourself trapped in a weird realm of existence for which you cannot explain, then chances are you have just entered the Twilight Zone. See ya!